The night my husband stood up at his mother's 70th birthday dinner and announced to 30 relatives that our daughter wasn't his, I was holding a sheet cake with candles still burning. I remember the exact moment the flames started to shake, because my hands were shaking, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should blow them out before the wax dripped onto the frosting. That was the last normal thought I had for almost a year. My name is Renee Calloway. I was 44 years old, and up until that Saturday evening in October, I believed I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, no marriage is perfect after 16 years, but a good one, a steady one, built on the kind of quiet trust you stop noticing because it's just always there, like the foundation of a house. Mark and I had been together since our 20s. We had a daughter, Josie, who was 14, sharp-tongued and gorgeous and utterly convinced she knew more about the world than either of us. She had Mark's stubborn chin and my mother's green eyes, and anyone who ever met the three of us together said the same thing: she's the spitting image of her daddy. Except, according to Mark, standing there in his father's dining room with a glass of bourbon in his hand and his sister Denise filming the party on her phone, Josie wasn't his daughter at all. "I did a test," he said. His voice wasn't even shaking. That was the part that broke something in me. He sounded almost relieved, like a man setting down a suitcase he'd carried too far. 3 weeks ago. I sent it in myself. The lab report came back yesterday. 0% match. I'm not her father. The room went silent in that specific way rooms go silent right before someone screams or someone cries, a held breath, 30 pairs of eyes swinging toward me like I was a car accident they couldn't look away from. My mother-in-law, Carol, pressed a hand to her chest. My sister-in-law lowered her phone half an inch, which told me everything about her priorities. And Josie, my Josie, was sitting 3 seats down the table in her favorite yellow sweater, staring at her father with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget. Not anger. Not yet. Just confusion, and underneath it, the first crack of a 14-year-old's whole world splitting open. I set the cake down before I dropped it. I want you to understand that about me, even in the worst moment of my life, I still thought to save the cake. That tells you something about the kind of woman I was raised to be. Quiet. Composed. Never make a scene, even when someone is making one out of your life in front of your entire family. "Mark," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "What are you doing?" "I'm telling the truth," he said. I should have said something years ago. I always had my doubts. She doesn't look like me. She's never looked like me. Denise, God bless her venomous little heart, chose that exact moment to say, "I always wondered, honestly." I want to tell you I had some dignified, movie-perfect response. I didn't. I laughed. It came out of me involuntarily, high and strange, because the whole thing felt so much like a nightmare that some part of my brain was waiting to wake up. Josie didn't laugh. Josie stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor like a scream, and she looked at her father, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, who cried at her 8th grade graduation, who called her Jelly Bean, until she made him stop 2 years ago because it was embarrassing, and she said, in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "Is that true?" "I have the lab report," Mark said, and he actually pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket like he'd been carrying it around all night, waiting for an audience. "It's real, Josie." "I'm sorry. I should have told you privately, but I couldn't keep pretending in front of everyone." I need you to sit with that sentence for a second, the way I've had to sit with it every day since. He couldn't keep pretending in front of everyone. Not I couldn't keep this from you. Not I needed you to know the truth. He needed the audience. He needed 30 witnesses to watch him set down that suitcase, because some men don't feel a thing is real until other people have seen them carry it. Josie ran. She didn't grab her coat, didn't say goodbye to her grandmother, just ran out through the Callahan's front door into an October night that was already dropping into the 40s, and I ran after her in low heels that were not built for chasing anyone anywhere. I found her 3 houses down, sitting on somebody's stone garden wall, hugging her knees, sobbing in that awful silent way where the sound gets stuck and only the shoulders move. Is it true? She asked when I sat beside her. Is Dad not my dad? And here is the thing I have to tell you, the thing that will make sense of everything that happened after. I looked my daughter in her red, swollen eyes, and I said, I don't know what that report says, baby. But I know one thing for certain, your father is your father. Whatever else is true, that's true. She didn't understand what I meant. Neither did she need to, not that night. That night, she just needed someone to hold on to while her entire universe rearranged itself, and I held on, because that's what mothers do, even mothers whose husbands have just detonated a bomb in the middle of their family. Here's what nobody in that dining room knew. What Mark himself didn't know, not really, not with proof, not yet. 14 years earlier, when Josie was 6 weeks old and jaundiced and screaming through colic, Mark had gone through a phase, a bad one, where he became convinced I'd cheated on him during a rocky stretch the year before we got engaged. It wasn't about Josie's paternity then. It was about his own insecurity, about a man who'd grown up with a father who left and a mother who never let him forget it, about a man who couldn't quite believe anyone would choose to stay. He'd never said the words out loud. He'd just get these dark, closed-off moods, disappear into the garage for hours, come back smelling like nothing, not even beer, just distance. I chalked it up to new baby stress. I had no idea, back then, that he'd once, just once, in a moment of paranoid weakness, swabbed Josie's cheek himself with a drugstore kit and mailed it off under a fake name. Desperate for an answer, he was too much of a coward to ask me for directly. That first test, 14 years ago, had come back inconclusive. Contaminated sample, the lab said. Try again. He never did. He buried the whole ugly episode, went back to being a decent, if emotionally guarded, husband and father, and I never knew any of it happened until much later, when the truth finally clawed its way out. So when Mark stood up at his mother's birthday and waved around a lab report, I didn't know, not for certain, whether he'd actually tested Josie recently, or whether something else entirely was going on. What I did know, 3 days later, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with Josie staying at my sister's house so she wouldn't have to watch us fight, was that my husband looked less like a wounded, betrayed man and more like a man executing a plan. Where's the actual report, Mark? I asked. Not the folded paper you waved around at your mother's party. The real thing. The lab, the chain of custody, the sample collection date. Why does it matter? You know if it's true or not. You were there. Did you cheat on me? I'm not going to dignify that with an answer a second time, I said, because I already told you the truth 14 years ago when you first got weird and cagey and started disappearing into the garage. I never cheated on you, Mark. Not once. Not before Josie, not after. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, that I'd referenced the garage days at all, since he thought that particular ghost was buried. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, I said quietly. I think you tested her once before, a long time ago, and it came back inconclusive, and instead of asking me like an adult, you buried it and let it rot for 14 years. And I think somebody's been feeding that rot lately. I want to know who. He didn't answer that. He looked down at his coffee instead, and that silence told me more than any confession could have. Somebody had gotten to him. Somebody had reopened a wound he'd sealed over years ago, and whoever it was had done it well enough, thoroughly enough, that a 50-year-old man had felt compelled to humiliate his wife and shatter his daughter in front of 30 relatives rather than have one quiet, adult conversation at his own kitchen table. I want to tell you I figured it out immediately, that I'm some brilliant amateur detective, but the truth is grief and fury don't leave much room for clear thinking. For the first 2 weeks, I mostly cried in the shower where Josie couldn't hear me, and made her pancakes she didn't eat, and fielded phone calls from relatives who wanted the real story, with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Carol, my mother-in-law, called to tell me she always sensed something was off, a woman who had bounced my daughter on her knee at Christmas for 14 straight years, suddenly discovering retroactive suspicion the moment her son gave her permission to have it. Denise posted something vague and pious on Facebook about the truth always coming out that got 43 likes from people who had eaten my cooking at Thanksgiving. It was my younger brother, Tommy, a claims investigator by trade, who first said the sentence that cracked the whole thing open. We were sitting on my back porch, Josie asleep upstairs, both of us nursing lukewarm coffee because neither of us could stomach anything stronger with everything so raw. "Ren," he said, "who benefits if Mark believes Josie isn't his? Not emotionally. Financially. Practically. Who wins?" I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd been so consumed by the emotional wreckage that I hadn't stepped back to ask the coldest, most useful question of all. And when I did step back, the answer arrived with sickening clarity. Mark's father, Walter Calloway, had died 8 months earlier and left behind a trust, a genuinely significant one. Oil lease money from land in West Texas that had been in the family for 3 generations, structured to pass equally to Mark, Denise, and, crucially, to any grandchildren by right of representation if Mark predeceased his own children. Josie, as Mark's legal daughter, stood to inherit a share someday that would otherwise, if Mark ever legally disestablished paternity, flow back into a pool split only between Denise's 2 kids and any future children Mark might have. Denise had 2 teenagers of her own from a divorce that had left her, by every account at every family gathering for the last 3 years, bitter and broke and increasingly resentful of her brother's steadier life. I sat very still on that porch for a long moment. "You think Denise did this?" "I think," Tommy said carefully, "you should find out who actually paid for that recent lab test and who suggested Mark take it in the first place." It took me 6 more weeks to build what I needed, and I want to be honest with you about how unglamorous that process was. There was no dramatic break-in, no hacking, no confrontation in a parking garage. There was a lawyer named Priya Anand, recommended by a friend from Josie's school, who specialized in family law and who listened to my entire story without once raising an eyebrow, because she had apparently heard versions of it 100 times before. There was a private paternity testing company whose customer service line I called under a pretext, pretending to be a confused customer trying to track down a report, until a very tired representative accidentally confirmed that yes, a kit registered under Mark's name had indeed been ordered, but not 3 weeks ago, like he'd claimed. It had been ordered 5 months earlier. 5 months. Right around the time Walter Calloway's estate had cleared probate and the trust documents had been finalized and mailed to all 3 surviving heirs. There was also, and this is the part that still makes my stomach turn, a conversation I had with Josie's pediatrician's office, because something had been nagging at me since that terrible night, a memory of Josie's newborn hospital paperwork, the kind every parent keeps in a folder somewhere and forgets about. I dug through our fireproof lockbox and found it, the original hospital birth records from the maternity ward, including, because our hospital had run a standard newborn screening panel that happened to include blood typing for medical purposes, a documented blood type for Josie recorded on day 2 of her life. I am not a geneticist. I am a marketing coordinator for a regional furniture chain. But I know how to use the internet, and blood type inheritance, while not proof on its own, is at least a consistency check, and what I found sent me straight to Priya's office with the folder shaking in my hands. Mark is O positive. I am O positive. Josie's hospital record listed her as O positive. There was no biological impossibility there at all, nothing that would have raised a single red flag with anyone who understood basic genetics. Which meant, whatever that lab report Mark had waved around said, something about the sample or the testing itself didn't add up, because a man doesn't need a DNA test to see a genetic impossibility, and there wasn't one. So whoever had engineered this had been counting on the fact that most people, most grieving, wounded, emotionally hijacked people, don't think to check blood types. They think to cry. They think to accuse. They don't think to pull hospital paperwork from 2012. Priya moved fast once she saw what I had. She filed a motion, because by then Mark had, God help him, actually consulted a divorce attorney and begun the process of legally contesting paternity and, by extension, custody arrangements and child support obligations going forward, requesting a fresh, court-ordered paternity test administered under strict chain-of-custody protocol at an accredited independent lab, with both parties present for sample collection, no exceptions, no mail-in kits, no unsupervised swabs. Mark fought it for exactly 4 days before his own new attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carla Objek, apparently sat him down and asked him precisely the questions he should have asked himself back in October. Where is the original lab's accreditation? Who registered the sample? Can you produce the chain of custody documentation? When Mark couldn't answer any of it, when it became clear he'd never even seen an official accredited report, just a printed page someone had handed him along with, apparently, a great deal of persuasive, tearful conversation about how he deserved to know the truth, his confidence cracked wide open. The court-ordered test took 3 weeks to process. I remember the day the results came in the way you remember any day that reorders your whole life. Josie came with us to Priya's office. She'd insisted, said she was old enough to hear it firsthand and not secondhand through slammed doors and hushed phone calls, and I was proud of her in a way that made my chest ache. Mark sat on the other side of the conference table looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 months. Priya opened the sealed envelope from the accredited lab and read the number out loud. 99.99% probability of paternity. Mark put his face in his hands. Josie didn't cry, not right away. She just looked at him, her jaw tight, her eyes hard in a way I'd never seen on my daughter's face before, and she said, "You told 30 people I wasn't yours." Grandma. Aunt Denise. My cousins. Everyone at school found out because Aunt Denise can't keep her mouth shut on Facebook. You did that to me over a piece of paper you didn't even check. I'm sorry, Mark said, and I believed that he meant it in the small, useless way a man means something after the damage is already permanent. I'm so sorry, Joe. I don't know what I was thinking, but I did. I knew exactly what he'd been thinking, because by then Tommy and I, with Priya's help, had traced the rest of it. Denise had been the one to gently suggest Mark get tested 3 separate times over dinner conversations that spring, always framed as concern. You deserve peace of mind, Mark. Don't you ever wonder, always circling back to old resentments about how Dad always favored your family and how it wasn't fair that Josie stood to inherit a full share when Denise's own kids, in her mind, needed it more. And Denise, we discovered through a records request Priya filed as part of the broader legal cleanup, had a cousin-in-law who worked, of all places, as a lab technician at a small independent testing facility with a shaky compliance history. A facility that, it turned out, had been quietly cited 18 months earlier for improper sample handling and had settled a civil suit out of court rather than face a state licensing review. It didn't take a genius to guess how an inconclusive 14-year-old sample and a 5-month-old order under Mark's name might have collided with a lab tech willing to print whatever result got requested, especially for family. We never got a full confession out of Denise. People like her rarely give you the satisfaction of one. What we got instead was better and stranger and far more satisfying than any dramatic scene in a movie, consequences that simply arrived, one after another, like a slow and very fair tide coming in. Priya filed a formal complaint with the state health department against the lab, attaching everything, the chain of custody failures, the prior citation, the timeline discrepancies. The lab lost its operating license within 4 months. Separately, because Walter Calloway's trust documents contained a standard no-contest clause, the fact that Denise had actively conspired to falsify or manipulate a paternity determination in an apparent attempt to redirect trust assets triggered a forfeiture review by the trust's own attorney, who had, fortunately for us and unfortunately for Denise, kept meticulous records of every family conversation and email thread related to the estate. Denise didn't lose everything. The courts are slower and more forgiving than any of us would like, but her share was frozen pending a formal accounting, and by the time it resolved 18 months later, the legal fees alone had eaten a chunk that would have made her mother weep if Carol hadn't, by then, quietly stopped speaking to her. Because that was the other thing nobody expected. Carol, who'd been so quick to declare she'd always sensed something was off the night her son detonated his family in her dining room, sat through every hearing, every revelation, and by the end of it, She was the one who drove to my house unannounced on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, stood on my porch with her umbrella dripping onto the welcome mat, and said, "I owe you an apology. I don't know how to give big enough." I should have defended that child instead of gossiping about her. I'm ashamed of myself. I let her in. I made her tea. Some bridges you rebuild not because the person deserves it automatically, but because you decide, deliberately, what kind of family you still want to have on the other side of the wreckage. Mark and I didn't survive as a married couple. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think pretending every story ends in reconciliation does a disservice to the real, complicated truth. What Mark did wasn't just believing a lie, it was choosing, in a moment of doubt, to humiliate me and devastate our daughter in the most public way possible rather than trust either of us enough to ask a quiet question first. Trust, once you understand that about a person, doesn't fully come back, no matter how many accredited lab reports arrive proving the biology was never even in question. We separated 8 months after the birthday party, quietly, with lawyers who were, thankfully, decent people doing their jobs rather than gladiators. He kept full custody rights, because whatever his failures as a husband, he loved Josie, and Josie, after a long and painful stretch of therapy that I am not remotely embarrassed to say we all needed, chose to keep him in her life on her own terms, which is exactly as it should be. What I remember most, though, isn't the lawsuits or the frozen trust or even Carol's rain-soaked apology on my porch. It's the night, almost a year to the day after that birthday dinner, when Josie and I sat at our kitchen table, just the two of us now, in the smaller house we'd moved into, with a yellow kitchen because she'd picked the paint color herself and declared it happy. And she looked up from her homework and said, out of nowhere, "You never once doubted me. That whole time. You never looked at me differently." "Never," I said. "Not for 1 second. How'd you know?" "Before you had proof, I mean. How'd you just know?" I thought about that question for a long moment, because it deserved a real answer, not an easy one. "Because proof tells you what's true on paper," I said finally. "But I already knew what was true in my house. I watched you grow inside me. I watched your father hold you the night you were born and cry like his heart had cracked open for the first time in his life. Paper can lie, baby. A room full of relatives eager for drama can lie. But I was there. I didn't need a lab to tell me what I already knew with everything in me." She didn't say anything to that. She just got up, came around the table, and hugged me the way she used to when she was small enough to still call me mommy instead of mom, and we stood there in that yellow kitchen for a long time, not needing to say another word, because some truths, once you've fought hard enough to protect them, don't need explaining ever again.